Hey, welcome back to the garage, and we're going to continue working on the motorcycle slash RV build today. If you haven't seen the previous videos, what I'm doing is I've taken a Ford A350 box truck, took the box off of it, and I'm building in its place a camper portion that's intended to be very versatile. I can camp in it, I can haul a motorcycle in it, or larger things as needed. So far, I've taken the box off and built the steel framework for that, and the plan is I'm going to cover that with composite panels, and that is what we're working on today. So my goals with this are to build something that is relatively lightweight. Weight's not much of an issue here, but less weight is always going to be better fuel economy. Obviously very strong and long lasting. So, well, also something that's relatively cheap and easy to build for a DIY person like myself. So what I'm doing is I'm making sandwich composite panels using fairly common materials. I've got some rigid foam insulation board. This is, the stuff you can get at any home center. This is Owens Corning, and some just cheap 1/4 inch plywood, 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter for the rest of the world. I'm going to be using fiberglass, so there'll be 10-ounce fiberglass cloths, coated with resin, of course, to make it more durable on the outside and obviously waterproof, because I'm not using, this is normal interior plywood. It's not, marine grade, expensive stuff or anything like that, so it does need to be protected. On the inside, where I don't need quite as much strength, I'm using a lighter 4-ounce fiberglass. So to bond all this together, first of all, when doing fiberglass with foam, the normal cheap fiberglass resin that's commonly used, it will dissolve this foam. So what I am using is, instead of a polyester resin, I am using epoxy. So this stuff, it's normally used for boat building. There's a couple brands of it. This is Total Boat. I've also used West System. I haven't seen much difference. This happens to be cheaper right now, so that's what I went for. So I'm going to be using this both for the fiberglass, which is what it's commonly used for, but also that's what I'm going to be bonding the plywood to the foam with. One tip, if you're going to use it for bonding things together, you need to add something in it to thicken it up a little bit. There'll be little bits of gaps in there that the epoxy doesn't necessarily do a good job of filling. So what this is what they call it, fumed silica. It's extremely lightweight. You probably should use a mask when you mix it, just because it's the lightest weight dust. You barely breathe on it and you'll have a cloud. But you mix this in with your epoxy, you make it thicker, and it works better for bonding things together. So I'll use that to bond the plywood to the foam. Put some bricks on it so that it's held flat overnight to make a good bond. And then, so this is going to be a multi-day process. So that'll be day one, getting things bonded together, putting some bricks on it. Day two, I can take the bricks off and I can do fiberglass on the outside, my 10-ounce fiberglass. That'll give me most of the, the strength for the exterior. Once that sets up, so it'll be day three now, I can flip the whole panel over, do my 4-ounce on the inside, and at that point I should be able to pick it up and mount it on the truck, which should be a challenge. Now, I've made some of these before, but I've never made one this large, to be honest. The ones I made before have been like a single sheet of plywood, and I've made some test panels. I've also made a small little workbench using it. In fact, I have part of that. So here you can see, relatively light, extremely rigid, nice and strong. So it's going to be much larger, and well, I'm going to video it so you'll see how it works out. If it goes terribly, you'll get to see it. And one thing I forgot to mention here is, instead of just using just the foam as the core structure, in strategic locations, I want to be able to add a little extra strength to it, but also I want to be able to have something that'll hold screws. So from the inside, I plan on screwing it to the steel frame, and with just, 1/4-inch plywood and foam, a screw is not going to hold very well. So what I did is I made some 1-inch plywood. Of course, they don't sell 1-inch plywood, so what I had to do is I just took 1/2-inch plywood and bonded it together with the same epoxy again. And so that is the same thickness as the foam. So in certain places where I want a little extra strength, I can have foam, I can have the plywood, and also that allowed me to attach the exterior to this with some screws just to help tie it together until the epoxy sets up. So I've got some of that for around the windows and around the door, and also just wherever I want to be able to screw it into the framework. So you can see I've got things laid out. I actually laid things out the other day when I cut the plywood to size, and you can see I've got marks for where all of my reinforcing is going to go. These are the 1-inch plywood that I made out of 2 pieces of 1/2-inch plywood. So I can get everything to line up. Now you'll note I tried to stagger the joints as much as possible. The goal is to not have any joints line up between any of the layers. So what I want to do now is, so that this doesn't slide on me, it's not really intended for the long-term permanent bond, but this is just drywall fiberglass tape. It's what you would normally use for joints in if you're doing drywall. I'm going to use this to hold the seams together, and that's really just so it doesn't slide around while I'm in the process of laying things up. One thing I did forget to mention is something I've learned with this foam. Well, 2 things. Some brands have a plastic film on the outside. This stuff doesn't, but I've had others where there's some plastic film that you really need to peel off because the epoxy doesn't stick to that plastic film very well. This doesn't have the film, but taking some rough sandpaper, this is 60 grit sandpaper, and what I did is I just went back and forth. See if you can see. I don't know if you can really see the texture on that, but there's a kind of a crosshatch texture. I went through all of them and put some pretty good scratches in it with the 60 grit sandpaper. The epoxy sticks much better than. I did some small test panels and forcefully broke them apart where I really wanted to see where it broke. When I didn't sand it, it tended to come apart at the bond, so the epoxy wasn't holding. When I do sand it like this, and I also do the same sanding on the 1/4-inch plywood, when I break it, the foam itself actually breaks, and it's much stronger, should hold together much better. So all I'm doing right now is I'm making sure I've got things roughly laid out, so tomorrow, once I start mixing epoxy, should go together pretty quickly. Well, it's bright and early the next morning, or bright and early for me. I'm not much of a morning person, but it's about 7:30, I think. So it's nice and cool this morning. So the epoxy should not go off too quickly, so I don't have to rush. That was the goal. I probably could have done this last night, but I'd be rushing, and I was tired, and it was actually a lot warmer yesterday, so this should work much better. So when working with epoxy, of course, gloves, very, very useful. We're going to see how much of this I can manage to film, but if I've got stuff all over my fingers, I'm obviously not going to be touching my camera. Now, important thing to know with epoxy, when you mix a cup of any large amount, while it's all together as one large mass, it generates extra heat, or it generates the same amount of heat, but the heat can't escape as well, so it gets extra hot. So you actually have much less time while it's in a cup than once you spread it out. Perfect example of that. Last night, in order to prime these pumps, I pumped out a little bit of epoxy and resin into a cup, and you can see that I set it on, I knew it was likely to melt, so I set it on a piece of foam so it didn't drip all over everything. It actually melted the cup. So that's what happens if you mix too much of it together at once and leave it in the cup. But the plan is I'm going to mix it, I'm going to spread it out, and get things laid out nice and quick. Once it's sprayed out, you have, or spread out, you have a lot more open time on it. So of course, mix the epoxy and the hardener together really well before you add any thickeners or anything like that. So, and with this fumed silica, like I said, it's really light and powdery. I probably should use a mask, but I tend to just be very careful with it. And stir it real slow before it gets mixed in. And like I said, it's once you get it spread out, you have more open time. So I tend to dump the whole cup. I probably could have mixed a lot more than that. I should have mixed a lot more than that. Like I said, this is the first time I've done a really large panel like this. So this might end up being just a spectacular failure, in which case this should be an interesting video. And this is where having things already labeled and marked out, except for having need to actually pay attention, definitely works nicely. Like I said, I haven't done a large one like this before, but I've done a whole lot of obsessing over how would I do this and pondering and thinking about it. So hopefully I've got it all figured out pretty well. We will find out. Well, that didn't go too badly. It took me a little over 2 hours, which is a little longer than I'd like it to take just because the epoxy does start setting up as soon as you start mixing it. As you can see, I've got a whole bunch of bricks just to hold it flat. Sometimes the plywood doesn't always sit flat. It'll warp a little bit. So this should make sure that the panel is every bit as flat as my floor. I'm fortunate enough to have a pretty flat concrete floor. So right now I just let it sit, and then tonight I'll pull the bricks off and do some sanding and get ready for putting fiberglass on this tomorrow. So last night, after the resin had time to set up, I came out, hit this with some 60 grit sandpaper to give it just a little better tooth for the resin to bite into. And I also hit the, this is going to be the front edge of the wall, and that's the bottom. I hit those with a router with a roundover bit to give it a little bit of a curve. Let this set and harden off, and I am going to trim around the edge before it gets completely hardened, but then that is it for today. And then tomorrow, we're going to flip it over and do the other side. Well, it's heavy, but I didn't have too much trouble flipping it over. That's one of the things that I was concerned about is, am I going to be able to flip this over or, by myself, or am I going to have to see if I can rope somebody into helping me? But that actually went pretty well. I don't have an easy way to weigh this, but I designed all of this in CAD and using Fusion 360, if you put in the material properties for everything. So I've got the material properties for the plywood and the foam. Now for the fiberglass is only going to add like 5 pounds maybe. And according to my CAD design, it should weigh about 180 pounds, which seems about right. And of course, I'm not picking the whole thing up. I'm just picking one end. So I don't think I'm going to film much of what I'm doing today. Today is mostly a repeat of yesterday. This is the interior face. So since it's not, or most of it is not exposed to any weather, I'm only doing 4-ounce fiberglass cloth, where I did 10-ounce on the other side, with the exception of the lower 12 inches or so does extend below the floor and will be, that's actually the part that I'm most concerned about, getting rock chips and things like that. So I'm going to do the 4-ounce everywhere, and then I'm going to do an extra layer of 10-ounce just on that lower edge. Well, the layup in the backside went pretty well. Got the 4-ounce cloth over the entire surface, and hard to tell because it's once it clears out from the resin, you can't really tell, but there's about a foot of 10-ounce cloth on top of that. So I should have, this is the part that's going to be below the floor on the inside, so there could be rock chips from the wheels. So I wanted to make sure that was well protected. So one thing to be aware of when you use epoxy is when it cures, you get what's called an amine blush, which is just a waxy, little bit of a waxy film on the outside of it, which isn't harmful, but if you want to paint it or do another layer of fiberglass and epoxy on top of it or anything like that, it won't stick to it. Luckily, it is water soluble, so I've got a bucket of soapy water with a Scotch-Brite pad here. I've got a bucket of clean water with the rag to rinse it off. So it's a matter of just scrubbing it and wiping it off. Not one of the more fun parts, but something's got to happen. So a whole lot of scrubbing. Well, I'd say it is done. We're done enough to mount onto the truck. Obviously, this will get paint on it. You know, we won't have the wood look. With the epoxy resin, it's actually UV light will damage it. So, you know, being out in the sun, it would get damaged. It would start cracking and fall apart after a year or two. So you do need a good coat of paint on top of it. So what's going to happen next is this will get mounted to the steel frame. I'm going to drive screws through the steel frame into this. That's why through here, through the middle, it's solid plywood. That's where I'm going to screw into so it gets a good bite. But I'm also going to use some construction adhesive to something with a little bit of give to it. So, you know, I don't want it to be anything too brittle that would break. So I think the construction adhesive will work well. The cutouts here, these are just rough cutouts for the windows. The actual windows are going to be slightly larger. But I wanted to go ahead and at least do the rough cut now, so that I can run a strap through there as I'm mounting it. So, you know, keep it from falling over on me. So I think that wraps it up for this episode. In the next one, I will, not sure if I can really, there's not enough room in here to film mounting it, but I'll at least show them on the truck then. So check that out then.